This is OwlUp, where learning happens in minutes, not hours. For a deeper journey, explore all our courses at owlup.co. Now, let's dive in. Welcome back to Climate Change, Science and Solutions. This is Chapter 3, where we're diving into those massive IPCC reports that always seem to make scary headlines but rarely get explained properly. Today we're cutting through the media noise to understand what these reports are actually for and why they matter so much to climate science. Let's get into it. The most important climate report on Earth does not say we're doomed. It says something stranger. The future is still mostly unwritten. Picture scientists from every continent arguing over the same evidence and ending up with one shared message the headlines almost never quote. Here's the twist the headlines miss. The IPCC is less like an apocalypse script and more like a detailed weather forecast for the next 50 to 100 years, complete with probabilities, caveats, and if-then branches. Hidden in its tables and graphs is a simple storyline. For every tenth of a degree we add, the risks step up. For every tenth we avoid, damage is prevented. The reports don't just track temperature. They track what that warming does to crops, coasts, cities, and health. Think of it as a global medical chart. Vital signs, temperature, sea level, lab results, greenhouse gas concentrations, and a diagnosis with treatment options. The data doesn't say all or nothing. It says more or less across a spectrum of futures that depend heavily on what we do in the next decade. So what does the data actually say once you get past the drama? Instead of shouting about catastrophe or promising easy fixes, the reports quietly stack lines of evidence: thermometer records, ocean heat content, glacier retreat, shifting rainfall, satellite measurements. Each line is like an instrument in an orchestra. On its own, it's interesting. Together, they play a very clear theme. That theme isn't everything collapses in 2030. It's that trends we can already measure today keep strengthening along predictable paths unless we change course, and that those paths still diverge sharply depending on choices made now. Start with the core numbers the summaries sometimes bury in footnotes. Across multiple lines of evidence, the reports find that the planet's surface has warmed by about 1.1 degrees Celsius since the late 1800s, and that more than 100% of that warming is due to human activities once you factor out volcanic eruptions and fluctuations in the sun. Natural factors alone would have left us slightly cooler, not warmer. That's why the language upgrades from likely to unequivocal. The pattern of warming, strongest over land, in the Arctic, at night and in winter, matches what physics predicts from added greenhouse gases, not what you'd expect from, say, a brighter sun. The documents then trace what that extra heat is doing. Global mean sea level is now rising about 3.4 millimeters per year, and the rate is accelerating. Tide gauges and satellites show this is faster than anything seen for at least 3,000 years. Most of that rise comes from two sources: seawater expanding as it warms, and land ice, glaciers and ice sheets, melting and flowing into the ocean. Coastal flooding that used to be once a century in many places is projected to become routine under higher warming levels, even without storms getting stronger. Crucially, the chapters don't talk about one monolithic climate impact. They break it down: heat waves becoming longer and more intense on every inhabited continent, heavy rainfall events gaining strength because a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, drought risk shifting in specific regions, ecosystems push toward thresholds as temperature, rainfall, and ocean acidity all change together. For many of these, the authors assign confidence levels and traceable attribution statements, showing where human influence is already detectable versus where it's still emerging from the noise. A big piece of the story is what remains in our control. The reports quantify a remaining carbon budget. For a 50% chance of holding warming to around 1.5 degrees Celsius, about 400 billion tons of CO2 could still be emitted from 2020 onward. At roughly 40 billion tons per year today, that spans single decades, not centuries. Cutting methane, responsible for about 30% of current warming, offers a quicker lever, with deep reductions projected to lower mid-century temperatures by a few tenths of a degree, buying time but not replacing the need to slash CO2. Underneath the scenario names and graphs lies a simple structure. If emissions stay high, warming keeps climbing, and the odds of crossing multiple regional tipping points rise. If they fall sharply this decade and reach net zero CO2 around mid-century, warming levels off and some risks stabilize instead of compounding. The documents are explicit that there is no single point of no return in the near term. Instead, each increment of avoided warming reduces harms. That's why the authors emphasize pathways, sets of actions consistent with different futures, rather than a single prediction. Your challenge this week? Look up one figure or table directly from an IPCC report, not a news article, and trace how that specific graph connects to something in your own region: coastlines, crops, energy, or health. Treat it like decoding a map. What does that one piece of evidence actually say about where you live? And what would have to change locally to bend the curve it describes? Think of one city you care about, where you live now, where your parents grew up, or a place you hope to visit. In the IPCC chapters, that city doesn't show up as a headline. It shows up as a colored dot on a map, a line on a graph, or a bar in a very likely range. Those visuals are like individual tracks in a music playlist. Some are about sea level along specific coasts, others about heat stress in urban areas, crop yields in key bread baskets, or wildfire conditions in Mediterranean-type climates. For example, AR6 includes maps showing how often hot day thresholds that used to be rare become the new normal under different pathways. Another figure charts how heavy downpours shift in particular regions: South Asia, the US Northeast, parts of Africa, under lower versus higher emissions. Yet another graphic compares how rapidly different sectors must cut emissions to align with the Paris goals: power, transport, buildings, industry, land use. Pick one such figure, and suddenly global change narrows down to a specific risk, in a specific place, on a timescale that intersects with a human life. Here's the twist in the data. The reports don't just warn, they map out leverage points. They show where cleaner grids, rethought food systems, and redesigned cities could bend trends faster than most people assume. It's less like a single verdict and more like a menu of futures, each with a price tag and a time limit. Your own lifetime spans several of these branches, which means your sector, your vote, your investments help decide which columns in those tables become real. So the real invitation is to treat these reports less like distant warnings and more like a user manual we're still writing in pencil. Think of each policy, project, or habit as a note added to a shared score. Some choices crank up the dissonance, others bring the music back toward harmony. We're already in the song. What changes now is which chorus we repeat. Start with this tiny habit. When you open the news or social media and see a scary climate headline, quietly ask yourself, what part of this comes from the IPCC and what part is spin? Then, before you scroll or share, take 20 seconds to Google IPCC Summary for Policymakers' latest report, and just read the one bolded sentence at the top of the first page you open. If you've got another 20 seconds, whisper out loud one concrete thing the IPCC actually says, like, warming is clearly human-caused, or every fraction of a degree matters, before you move on. This way, you're training yourself to check the source and anchor your emotions in what the data actually says, not just the headline. This was OwlUp, your daily step forward. This series continues with more chapters on OwlUp.co. Visit OwlUp.co to access the complete course and continue your learning journey. See you there!